Tangier at the Crossroads, Memories of Cosmopolitanism and Dreams of Technological Modernity. This is a video version of an online lecture I did for the Aga program in Islamic Architecture at MIT on September 21st. I would like to thank the Aga professor for Islamic Architecture and director of the Aga program, Nasser Rabat. I would also like to thank Jose Luis Arguello for his support, including this amazing poster. You may hear me alternate pronunciations between the normative English pronunciation of the city Tangier and Tanja, the Arabic pronunciation. Nothing is implied by this, no opinion or politics or anything of that nature. This is simply a reflection of force of habit. I tend to use the word that fits the language I'm speaking at the time. It may not happen, but in any case, nothing is implied if it does. My talk today is focused on two specific periods: the early 20th and early 21st century. These were periods of significant growth in the city of Tangier, entailing major construction and infrastructure development. This presentation presents interesting parallelisms between what went on in terms of construction and urban expansion during those two periods. Yet the circumstances in which these parallel developments occurred could hardly be more different. During the first period, Tangier was becoming an increasingly international city, and eventually a formally declared international zone, even as the rest of Morocco was coming under French and Spanish protectorate status. During the second period, Morocco had been independent for more than half a century, or approximately half a century. Effectively, this presentation is the descriptive portion of a larger work that looks a bit more profoundly into these circumstances and the parallels between them. Officially, Tangier became an international zone on May 14, 1924, but it had been a de facto international zone long before that. This slide shows a few key dates in the history of Tangier, but it is the latter portion that is most relevant today. Tangier was essentially rebuilt after the English destroyed much of the city when they were driven out in 1687. And the city that goes into the 17th century is quite a different city than the city that existed prior to that. The internationalization of Tangier began sometime in the 18th century. It was still a small city with a population of mostly Muslims and Jews who lived within the safety of the city walls. Then the Moroccan Sultan commanded that all permanent foreign representation be established in Tangier. The legations and consulates would all be established within the walled city until the 20th century. This map from a 1901 guidebook shows their precise locations. Through this process, a small community of Christians became established in the city, and Tangier becomes the first Moroccan city to have a mosque, a synagogue, and church, all inside the Medina walls. First and only, I should say. This concentration of the diplomatic residences or diplomatic buildings and constructions starts to change in the first decade of the 20th century. This slide shows the old American legation in Tangier, the last diplomatic presence to leave the Medina, about 40 years after all the others. It is now a museum. Things really start to change in the early decades of the 20th century as European forces begin jockeying for power in Morocco as well as in the regions that would eventually be colonized by European powers. Most notably, the French and Spanish in Morocco. Germany had grand ambitions, but it was largely muscled out by the Treaty of Algeciras. Things really started to change during the run-up to two treaties, both promulgated in 1912, that led to Morocco being divided into French and Spanish protectorate, while also ostensibly guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Morocco under the Sultan, at least in theory. Hence the term protectorate. It was the first time since the 11th century that the entire territory that constitutes Morocco fell under foreign rule. According to the terms of these treaties, Tangier would have been part of the Spanish protectorate, but with Britain already in control of Gibraltar, the well-established enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla on the northern Morocco coast, and France in control of all the Mediterranean ports of Algeria, the international status of Tangier was seen as essential to maintaining the freedom of shipping in and out of specifically the Mediterranean Sea. This mattered not only to Mediterranean nations themselves, but also to Germany, the Netherlands, the US, all of which nations were party to negotiations to preserve the international status of Tangier, at least at various points. The difference in the architecture and urban structure of cities in the Spanish and French zones is clearly visible in Morocco. Antonio Bravo Nieto has written the definitive study of Spanish protectorate architecture in Morocco. French protectorate cities, on the other hand, have been much more studied and much more written about. And there is no single definitive history. Interestingly, although, or perhaps because, the history of Spain and Morocco had been so much more tightly intertwined prior to the 20th century, protectorate architecture in the Spanish zone often seems to intentionally repudiate those historical links. On the other hand, architecture and urban planning in the French zone may sometimes be seen as fetishizing Moorish aesthetics. The architecture of Tangier, on the other hand, is remarkably diverse and varied, reflecting numerous periods and styles. The late 19th and early 20th century was clearly a fascinating time in the urban development of Tangier. As we have noted, throughout much of history, the city has been constrained by its walls. With the exception of some fortifications and isolated dwellings, the area outside the walls belonged to the tribes of the Fas region. Most official buildings were, in fact, on the central street, Rue Seine, or sometimes referred to as Main Street in English guides to the city. All this had changed by the 1920s. Accurate information on the growth of the city, especially as an interrelated entity, can be challenging to come by. Tangier is a bit player in the history of both the Spanish and French protectorates, though both countries longed to have the city under their control. Much happened in Tangier that impacted the greater world, and it was the stage for several significant diplomatic crises that have been written about, but little study has been devoted to the urban development of the city itself. I recently read Edith Wharton's travel narrative In Morocco, and found it representative of most early 20th century work on Tangier and Morocco. Wharton dismissed Tangier quite quickly in the beginning of the book. It was the location of her disembarkation, but she finds the city uninteresting. Indeed, she is in a hurry to get out of the city and the Spanish zone altogether. She also notes that plenty has been written about Tangier. This is true enough, but until very recently, most writing about 20th and 21st century Tangier was writing that either overemphasized the exotic and the mysterious, or was tinged by nostalgia and subjectivity, or that passed off superficial observations as generally applicable facts. Western fiction in Tangier uses the city and its inhabitants as little more than an exotic backdrop for romance and intrigue. Fortunately for me, these are not the only sources of documentation about this period. There's a collection of approximately 2,000 glass negatives belonging to the Tangier American Legation Institute for Moroccan Studies that helped me considerably to construct this narrative. This collection was, in fact, the jumping off point for my investigations into the urban history of Tangier during the international period, and you will notice that most of the images showing the city during that period are from the collection. There are numerous images that show the expansion of the city as it happened. There are photographs of the construction of the port, the railways, and of residential areas outside the city walls. There are also images showing events that made global news at the time, but that are not scarcely more than a footnote today. Until the end of the Protectorate, it has looked as if Tangier would continue to be one of the more important Moroccan cities in the post-colonial nation. The independence movement was active in Tangier, occasionally taking advantage of a system under which foreign embassies could extend their protection to Moroccan citizens, and this allowed activists to hide there and others to hide there, and this power of protection to be manipulated for political ends. On November 9th, 1947, Mohammed V chose the city to give the first speech clearly signaling his support of Moroccan independence in what was then the market square just outside the city walls. It was followed by a speech by his unveiled daughter, Lela Aisha, who called on Moroccan women to participate in politics. Major constructions continued well into the 1950s. Indeed, the United States built a large, new consular complex that didn't even open until 1962, 6 years after Morocco gained its independence. The Spanish Cathedral and the bullfighting ring are other examples. For the most part, however, rapid urban development abruptly slowed to a crawl almost immediately after independence. This was probably a result of regional rebellions in the Rif almost immediately after independence. Whatever the reason, for decades the central government, Mahsen, paid little attention to northern Morocco, including Tangier, though the city was slightly better off than other northern cities, simply because it is a port city at the northern end of roadways, railways that connected urban centers throughout the rest of Morocco. Other cities in the north had some of these advantages, and others to the east, such as Tetuan and Nador, had the advantage of proximity to the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Still, in Tangier and across northern Morocco, the illicit economy was as important, or perhaps more important, than above-the-board activity. This period of relative stagnation continued until the start of the 21st century. I arrived in Tangier for the first time in 1991, near the end of this period. I taught technical writing at the King Fahd School of Translation and worked on the development of the libraries of the American Legation Museum. While there had certainly been significant changes since 1956, my research revealed that the city itself hadn't changed all that much, save for unplanned and unregulated construction to accommodate the arrival of rural populations looking for opportunities or hoping to escape through Tangier to Europe. Expansion was mostly in areas outside the city center, but even in the old Medina, courtyard houses were broken up to be made into smaller rental properties, and once single or two-story buildings were expanding vertically. Because of this expansion, this very rapid expansion, the 1990s were a difficult period in Tangier. The growing population was straining resources, and finding work or emigrating to Europe wasn't as easy as it had once been. The legitimate economy was largely stagnant, and there were chronic water shortages, a great deal of petty theft, minor crime, homelessness, and drug use. The use of keef or hashish had been relatively tolerated at the time, but these were not the only substances abused. There was a fair amount of alcoholism, glue sniffing, etc. Small wonder that the city I arrived in was far from the flourishing cosmopolitan city that, not without reason, evoked such nostalgia among self-proclaimed real Tanjawis. Both the Spanish and the French maintained large consulates and other cultural institutions, and there was still a significant expatriate community who spent at least part of each year in Tangier, but most other diplomatic delegations and international agencies had moved to Rabat and Casablanca, or perhaps Marrakesh. An awareness of this stagnation is important if one is to understand just how significant development has been since the 2000s. How significant and clear as well, and easily seen. I left Morocco to pursue my PhD in 1996, but I've been fortunate to get back often since. Indeed, in the summer of 1999, I was in an intensive Arabic course in Tangier when Hassan II died and Mohammed VI ascended to the throne. Mohammed VI has been a surprising, almost revolutionary figure in many ways that are out of the scope of this presentation. For our purposes, what is most important is that he reversed the policy of neglect towards the northern part of Morocco. Mohammed VI wasted no time before making a tour of northern Morocco. More importantly, his government has invested heavily in the region, funding everything from renovations of historic sites to enhancing infrastructure. Also with the cooperation of European agencies and other development agencies, NGOs, governmental agencies, and private enterprises. In many ways, the developments of the past 15 years parallel those that occurred in Tangier between the two world wars. And the city is once again a magnet for foreign residents and investors, though the makeup of those groups has changed significantly. The rest of this presentation compares these two periods with regard to 4 key points: transportation, infrastructure, urban planning, and tourism. Needless to say, these topics are intertwined, and they will be, as I will focus primarily on structures, And moreover, my discussion of these topics will necessitate some consideration of residential housing and industrialization. So here we see two of the earliest buildings built outside the city walls, the Cervantes Theatre and St. Andrew's Church. In this slide, we see the British consulate and the French consulate. The city spilled out in every direction. Foreigners also built villas in the area that became known as the Old Mountain and the Marchand Plateau, and nations built extensive diplomatic complexes, such as the Spanish complex and the French complex, which still exist today. Here we see some of the developments along the waterfront and the Boulevard Pasteur. From World War I until 1956, the growth of Tangier is largely attributable to global forces that are too complex to be discussed in detail in this presentation. Suffice it to say that it grew rapidly, and it grew with a large influx of expatriate or foreign residents and foreign immigrants. By 1921, when Volume 7 of Villes et Tribus de Morocco, Tangier et sa zone is published, nearly all European schools and diplomatic presences were located outside the walls, though most fairly close to the Grand Soko and the Marchand Plateau. And you can see a few of these in the map that is taken from that volume. Aviation began in Tangier in 1914 when 3 planes made their way from Larache to Tangier, landing in the Country Club. This eventually became the Aero Club de Tangier, and the first commercial airline was established in 1919. It operated for 6 years, becoming part of the Compagnie Générale Aéropostale, eventually becoming part of Air France. A transportation airport, however, wasn't built until the 1950s at Bouchelef, 12 miles outside of town near the coast. In 2008, it was expanded, as you can see in these slides. The Compagnie Franco-Espagnole de Chemin de Fer de Tanger-Fes was established in 1914, and rail service came to Tangier in 1927. There were 3 stations, the first to the southeast at Morocco, the second just outside the port below the Medina, and the third right inside the port at the passenger terminal. The tracks ran along the beach between what was then the Avenue de España, now Avenue Mohammed VI, and the beach. Today, however, there are no tracks that run along the beachfront. City Center is now an officially designated area surrounded by the new train station, which accommodates Al Borak, Morocco's new high-speed rail service, as well as the older trains. The Al Borak service, operates between Casablanca and Tangier, but not unlike Amtrak's much slower Acela service, it has to slow down when it approaches the Rabat-Casablanca metro area. 150 miles over the last 33.9 miles versus 250 miles per hour on 115 miles. Here you will find the Hilton Hotel, the Hilton Garden Inn and the Hilton Hotel, the Ibis Hotel, chains like McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, and many local chains, as well as a shopping center, the things that would make up a contemporary city center. Port facilities. The first significant port facilities in Tangier were built by the English, who had been given Tangier as part of a dowry. They built the mole in the 17th century, but they destroyed it and many other important buildings in the city when they were driven out by the Moroccans. The Cap Spartel Lighthouse was built to the west of Tangier in 1864 at the dangerous confluence of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, but Tangier wouldn't have a new port until 1908, started in 1905. Until then, smaller boats rowed out to larger ships in the Bay of Tangier. It was built with German financing, including that of A. Renschhausen, who built the buildings along the Renschhausen Terrace, but who left the city after World War I. By the 1930s, planes, trains, automobiles, and ships could all be accommodated, thus providing easy access to the rest of the country from Tangier. Population. In 1870, And in spite of its status as a diplomatic center for Morocco, Tangier had only about 400 foreign residents out of a population of about 20,000 people. By 1907, that number had increased to approximately 10,000, a quarter of the city's population, and it continued to grow from there. Tangier also had a large Jewish population, roughly equivalent to the European population. Manufacturing, shipping, fishing, finance, and of course a host of illegal activity all prospered. As well as tourism, there were casinos and entertainment facilities, as we've already seen, the Teatro Cervantes and the Corsal, all of which existed in the city as it expanded. By the middle of the 20th century, almost all non-Moroccan residents, as well as most wealthy Moroccan families, had left the Medina to homes outside the city. After World War II, most Moroccan Jews emigrated to Europe, Israel, the US, or other places. After independence, most diplomatic activity moved to Rabat, with the American legation, as mentioned previously, being the last to go. Thus began the decades of neglect that the city endured. In the early 2000s, things begin to change. Now we advance to the second phase of our presentation, the early 21st century. The most important transformative element in this has been the construction of the Tanjimed Port 40 kilometers east of Tangier. The first phase of what is envisioned to be a massive port eclipsing that of Casablanca opened in 2007. Tanjimed had a capacity of 3.5 million containers and was served by rail, as well as highways. Prior to this, only Oujda near the border with Algeria and Tangier had rail service, both lines originating in the south. Tanjimed 2 opened in 2019, expanding the port's capacity to 9 million containers. It is now the largest port on the Mediterranean and the largest in Africa. There's also a passenger terminal where most ferry service now arrives, the exception of one or two. And the port is part of a free zone, with a second free zone coming just outside Tangier in the industrial zone. This is all part of a plan to make the Medina and surrounding area more welcoming to tourists and leisure visitors. Accordingly, the old port is now only accommodating cruise ships and the high-speed ferry from Tarifa. Fishing boats have been moved to a separate section of the port just to the left, if one is facing the strait. The areas to the right will accommodate yacht and leisure boats, a yacht club in effect. There is also a shopping area of upscale and chic boutiques. As I mentioned previously, there is no train service into the port. The tracks and small beachfront clubs that once lined the beach have been torn down, and the avenue is completely reconfigured with large sidewalks and a new configuration for vehicular traffic. Parking for beachgoers is underground, with shops, restaurants, and nightclubs in front of the parking opening directly onto the beach. So it's an interesting setup that you can see here under construction, where in effect there is a park or a green area that is higher than the beach. These storefronts built into the front of a parking area that's underground, and you can walk from these storefronts or restaurants, etc., right out to the beach. Above the parking is a long promenade, the corniche, that extends from the port to the beach at city center, and then picking up again after a small commercial area, pre-existing commercial area, and extending to Malabata. So this is a distance of about 2 miles, and that commercial area I mentioned is a walkable area. It's quite small, and you can just simply walk through it. Manufacturing has moved out to the industrial road on the road to Tetuan, where there is also a new sports complex. A uniform bus service has replaced the haphazard system of private companies operating mass transit throughout the city, large taxis, small taxis, and various buses. But taxis and grand taxis still provide service throughout all neighborhoods. Tangier does not have a tramway like Casablanca or Rabat, although one is on the cards and in planning. The net effect is that the center of Tangier is now safer, easier to navigate, and this is paying off in terms of tourism, both within Morocco, but especially from abroad. Predictably, of course, this has led to gentrification. Now what was once the center and even the former periphery of the city, is unaffordable to many Moroccan residents. Middle-class Westerners now occupy some of the most affordable housing that was available to Tanjawis, as well as residents from outside who come for jobs, white-collar jobs. Whereas for decades, most foreigners were afraid to venture any further into the Medina than the Kasbah, the Sain, the main street that led from the Grand Soko we saw to and the legation. There are now riads throughout the Medina, and tourist venture in every corner. That said, recent governments have also placed a renewed emphasis on green space, and few of the newer neighborhoods are as unplanned as those which sprang up in the 1920s and 30s, Casabarata, Beni Makada, etc. One of the first things that happened in terms of green space in the city was that walls around cemeteries and government properties were torn down. Many of these areas became parks. This had the added benefit of deterring much of the petty crime in the city, cutting down on walking time, and making the city much more manageable. It also created panoramic vistas that allow you to see from one part of the city to the other, whereas these views would previously have been blocked by walls. Water shortages have effectively been remedied by the damming, which is also used for hydroelectric generation. Wind turbines are visible from Tangier to the east on the road to Malabata, and sewage does not flow into the bay any longer. Amandis is the water and electricity provider for the city and also the provider of sewage treatment facilities. Work still needs to be done around the Wedelhar, an industrial runoff canal between the Tangier and Malabata beaches, but that water now appears to be processed before it reaches the bay, so it's further upstream that it still seems to be problematic. There's also great emphasis on adaptive reuse and restoration of historic sites throughout the city, and here we see Burj Al Hajawi near below the Hotel Continental, and Burj Al Salama, which was a battery of cannons, is now restored. In short, Tangier is achieving some success in its attempts to become a truly cosmopolitan city once again. But as is often the case in many cities around the world, it may be at the expense of the most underprivileged. Several NGOs are attempting to address this situation, most notably the women's cooperative known as Darna, or Our House. But many of the city's younger residents still dream of leaving for Europe. In addition, many come from the interior or other countries in West Africa and even other continents, from Asia, from Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa. They all get there somehow. Over the last 2 decades, Morocco has increasingly turned its attention to West Africa with the view to becoming a regional economic power and a mover for development that simultaneously helps the Moroccan economy. The large, mostly homeless populations of West Africans and people from southern Morocco are known as haraga, i.e. young men who spend anywhere from days to years sleeping in the cemeteries or on piles of fish net in the port, hoping to stow away on a ship bound for Europe. But many die before arriving. Again, this parallels the early 20th century, but perhaps in reverse. As many Europeans come to Tangier to make their fortune, Moroccans were recruited to come to Europe in order to keep factories open and even to join soldiers going to war. Now, however, these migrants are unwelcome in Europe, and Morocco, like its neighbors around the region, is being expected to police migration and smuggling into Europe. Clearly, there are many parallels between the growth of Tangier in the early 20th and the early 21st centuries, but the differences are telling. In the former, the Moroccan government had globalization forced upon it, largely by debts incurred by the central government trying to suppress dissent in the Beled Siba, the territories only nominally under the central government's control, and its quest for the trappings of modernity. In the 21st century, Morocco has actively sought to integrate in the global world order and the global economy. This has led to improvements in transportation, infrastructure, and the economy, but it has also left behind the marginalized. The economy of Tangier is less dependent on tourism than it once was, but still an enormous section of the economy. Morocco has done a remarkable job controlling the COVID pandemic in its first phase, but as things have slowly begun to reopen, Tangier has emerged as a hotspot of infection in the second wave. This may have a potentially devastating impact in a city in which tourism is such a large part of the economy and which so many are already underemployed or unemployed. But in case it was not made clear through my presentation, I consider Tangier a gem of a city. Both Moroccans and immigrants, i.e. European and American expats, a term I am reluctant to use, are fond of peering out onto the horizon in an effort to catch a glimpse of the Spanish coast. But I don't see this as the main selling point of the city. To me, it is the city itself that is exciting. It is, of course, an important part of the larger Mediterranean ecosystem, but it is also at the juncture of Africa's Mediterranean and Atlantic coast and the westernmost part of the Islamic world. All of these elements figure prominently in the city's architecture. The obsessive fixation on the northern neighbors always seemed exoticizing, reducing the cultural complexity of this urban space to a postcard. I'm delighted to see that over the last decade or so, Morocco has astutely invested in a way that demonstrates it also sees itself that way. It is increasingly becoming a hub for the economic and cultural activity of Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Two built elements are emblematic of that in my mind. The first is the new ultra-modern train station of Tanjimed that beautifully incorporates elements of Andalusian and medieval Maghribi architecture in a high-speed or connected to a high-speed rail terminal. The second are the joining coastal roads / promenades that skirt the city. First runs from Malabata in the east to the port, past the newer, more European parts of town, where it connects to the other road running southward along the sea, past the old fortifications and the Kasbah high on the hill. I am hopeful that Morocco will continue to embrace the future without sacrificing the beauty and genius of its unique melange of architectural and cultural styles.